Good afternoon. Welcome to today's uh, Manhattan meeting with the LaRouche organization for Saturday, December 10th. The physicist Max Planck is said to have once stated that when you change the way that you look at things, the things you look at change. We're in a situation in the globe in which it's very important that we change the way we look at things. Uh, And there's been a process of discussion that's been initiated by members of the LaRouche organization and specifically by the founder of the Schiller Institute, also Helga Zepp-LaRouche, uh, to discuss what she calls the 10 principles. Now, what's important about this discussion and about what's going on globally is that various observers, some of them commentators, some of them members of the diplomatic service, have been very shocked or unnerved by certain statements that have been made by President Vladimir Putin of Russia. And there's been some attempts to claim that there's a change in Russian nuclear policy as a result of the statements that he made. Today's program is going to spend some time discussing why that's not the case. What we'll do initially actually is to refer briefly to Putin's statements. And we have this was actually from something that happened this past Wednesday. This was a discussion that happened with a member of a foundation called the Center of Civil Analysis and Independent Research, Svetlana Makovetskyaya. So she was questioning Putin about this and was speaking to him concerning the idea of how, in fact, he thought about the issue of nuclear weapons. And here's what he had to say. He said, about Russia not being the first to use under any circumstances. Well, if it's not the first, well, actually, you've seen a bit of this already on the screen. Let me just read along with your screen there. She said there was a large number of fears with respect to the issue and proposed that the president, in a gesture of goodwill, made a statement that Russia will under no circumstances be the first to use nuclear weapons. About Russia not being the first to use under any circumstances? Well, if it's not the first to use under any circumstances, then it won't be the second to use as well, because a nuclear strike on our territory greatly limits the chances of using, the president said. The Russian leader said Russia regards nuclear weapons as a means of defense, as an opportunity for a retaliatory counterstrike. Our strategy for using the means of defense, and we regard weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, as defense. It's all built around the so-called retaliatory counterstrike, meaning when a strike is being inflicted on us, we inflict one in response, Putin said. Large amounts of so-called tactical U.S. nuclear weapons are located on European territory. We have not transferred and do not transfer our nuclear weapons to anyone, but of course we will protect our allies with all the means at our disposal if necessary, Putin stressed. After all, no one notices and or wishes to notice and see what is being done and said in the neighboring countries, in the Western countries. And then he went on to say, I have already said we do not keep our own nuclear weapons, including tactical ones, on the territories of other countries. The Americans do, in Turkey and a number of other European states. Putin noted that when Liz Truss, this was the former Prime Minister of England, said last summer that she was ready to push the nuclear button, nobody even paid, quote, the slightest attention to what she had said. However, everything that we say in our statements is instantly blown out of proportion, and the whole world is sent into a panic over such remarks, the Russian president said. We are not going to wave these weapons around like a razor blade, he added. throughout the world. But of course, we do perceive from the fact that they exist. They do exist. They are a natural deterrent. They do not provoke any expansion of the conflict, but they are a deterrent. I hope everyone understands this, Putin maintained. Now, many different commentaries have happened as a result of those remarks, but those remarks themselves came as a result of another discussion. That other discussion is something that Harley Schlanger will discuss in a few moments. But before he does that, what we want to do is to give an example of what we think the real problem is. The problem could be thought about as one of the contrast between strategic calculations and miscalculation, which is what many of the West do as a result of their reliance on the if you will, the authoritarian power of artificial intelligence over everything, and the notion that statistics and algorithms are supposed to determine how thinking works, versus understanding real human thought, the kind of human thought that is characteristic of, for example, poetry. Many years ago, Lynn LaRouche wrote a piece called "Poetry Must Supersede Mathematics in Physics." We think we could paraphrase that for this occasion and say that poetry must supersede mathematical thinking and statistical thinking in matters of warfare. And actually understanding how Russia thinks and trying to actually understand Russia not as an enemy, but as an interlocutor, establishing a bond of trust based not on lying, deception, and sophistry, but based on an actual arrival at a conception of principle. This is the difference in what we are trying to discuss, and we've had some examples of this recently. Helga Zepp-LaRouche was able to have a conversation, for example, with a Vladimir Solovyev of Russia. We're going to excerpt that conversation. We actually urge that everybody take a good look at it. It's about twice as long as what we're going to show you. But it's the dialogue between them and also the dialogue with the implicit audience in Russia that was seeing this program that we'd like to call your attention to as we continue our discussion later of Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 principles.
I have to say I was quite impressed with your very tough point of view, should I say that, very revolutionary. Definitely not mainstream of current European political ideas. How come? It looks like the dawn of Europe, the book that has been written more than 100 years ago, suddenly comes true. What are we facing right now? And what should be done in order to save the world?
Well, I think the problem is that we are, as some of the Russian officials have stated recently, we are already at a state of war between NATO and Russia. And that is, many people in many countries are extremely worried that this may lead to nuclear war. And if it would come to that, I don't think that it would be a limited nuclear war. I think regional war or the use of only tactical nuclear weapons, I think this is all ruled out. And if it comes to the use of only one single nuclear weapon, it would have the danger of a global nuclear war, and that would mean the annihilation of civilization. And for me, I think you have to start with that. This is why I have suggested 10 principles for a new international security and development architecture, which is drawing very much on the example of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of religious war in Europe. And I'm really fighting very hard to put this on the agenda before it is too late.
So what are those 10 principles, and what makes you think that current political power in Germany, but basically in USA, we realize that whatever is there right now in Germany is just a reflection, it's just another projection of American point of view, that they will hear you, that you won't be punished severely for your point of view? Because nowadays it's not even possible to talk about the freedom of speech and the freedom of philosophical ideas in Europe.
I know it's not allowed, and you are being, ostracized immediately, and worse. But I think, we are in a situation where, this is not a tenable situation. Germany, for example, has lost presently all of its sovereignty with the present government, at least concerning certain ministers. And, we are running against a collapse in Germany. The economic situation is absolutely devastating. The result of the sanctions which Germany imposed against Russia on orders practically of the United States is boomeranging, and the blowback is threatening the existence of Germany as an industrial nation. So, this will become apparent in the next weeks and months. And I think, we are in an epochal change. It's not just the war between the West and Russia, but, the result of the policies imposed against Russia in particular have led to a counter reaction. The entire global South is in a revolutionary spirit to establish a just new world economic order. And this is a revival of the non-aligned movement, which was already on that course in the 70s. And now I think it is unstoppable. You have now the emergence of a completely new system, which, is the BRICS, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. All of these countries, are reacting to the policies coming, especially from the British and the United States, and they are forming a new world economic order. And, some people may think that it is enough if you have a multipolar world. The unipolar world is definitely over. But I'm of the opinion that even multipolarity is not sufficient, because it still has the potential of a geopolitical confrontation. So this is why I think the most advanced proposal to overcome that in the present world comes from President Xi Jinping, who is talking about the shared community of the future of mankind. And my 10 principles basically are an effort to elaborate principles how we can get people to understand what the new paradigm is in which we have to move. And that is a very deep philosophical conception. I've been working together with my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, on that for the better part of the last 50 years. So I'm convinced that, this is resonating with what the world right now urgently needs, which is a new conception. The question is really, can we as a human civilization give ourselves an order which allows the long-term survivability of our species? So this is the biggest challenge to our intelligence you can have. And that's the 10th point of my 10 principles, I'm convinced that man is fundamentally good, and that the evil in the world is the result of a lack of development. So, I'm confident. I think the danger is incredibly big, but on the same time, I'm also extremely optimistic that a solution to this present calamity can be found.
Well, but how can you imagine those guys in US, in UK, in Germany giving up the complex of superiority, where they still consider other part of humanity, according to Kipling, half beast, half humans, as in the burden of the white man. So how can you imagine Americans suddenly recognize that they're not the chosen nation? They won't come with it. They don't want to do it. No one ever gave up the complex of superiority before being defeated. There's no brain to apply to. Look at Biden. There's no brain to apply to. There's a number of stereotypes. And that's about it.
Yeah, but, look, Joseph Borrell from the EU made this incredible statement that the EU is a beautiful garden.
Yeah, surrounded by jungle, yeah.
And that made him the laughing stock of the whole world. I
Yeah, but
had
he
many
is an idiot that
discussions.
represents diplomacy over you. What kind of idiot right now represents the EU as a top diplomat? That's annoying.
Yeah, but in a certain sense, you have to laugh about it, as many of the countries of the global south are doing. I mean, the countries of the developing sector are right now in a mood where they recognize that this is the effort to keep the colonial order. But that is not the look. All of these countries have a different tradition. The United States, for example, uh, made their independence in the War of Independence against the British Empire. And the Constitution of the United States was the first real republic in the history of mankind. And if you look at the principles of Benjamin Franklin, of George Washington, of John Quincy Adams exactly said what we are saying today, that you need a partnership of perfectly sovereign republics, and the United States should not go out and look for foreign monsters. Then Lincoln had the same idea. Franklin D.
Right.
Roosevelt designed when he designed the Bretton Woods system, it was meant as the first priority to overcome
agree.
underdevelopment of the developing countries. So even Kennedy, had a beautiful idea about the role of technology would solve all the poverty in the third world. So there is a tradition in the United States which is completely different. The problem with the United States right now is that they have adopted the model of the British Empire as the basis to rule the world in an unipolar world, in an unipolar style. But that is not the whole United States. I mean, the people of the United States essentially are good. It is what some people call the Mickey Met Ray McGovern, who is a
Right.
it's the military industrial complex plus the
True.
Congress plus the media plus the Silicon Valley, but that is a small minority. They look like the all-powerful force right now. But I think this other tradition of America is there, and we are trying very hard to make a revival of the best traditions of the
I
United
hope that
States. The
you
same goes
succeed.
for.
I hope you succeed. Unfortunately, the time is running out. And excuse my smile. The reason is that my wife's name is Helga Zepp. So when I say Helga Zepp, I feel like talking to a relative. Should I say?
That's funny.
Yeah, that's quite unusual, should I say. And I love what you're saying. And I love your very sweet, idealistic, but very thought through, based on the belief that humans are better than they are.
If you just joined us, welcome to today's Manhattan Town meeting of the LaRouche Organization. And what you've just seen is an excerpt from a December 7th interview done by Russia's Vladimir Soloviev with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and head of the Schiller Institute. And we're contrasting the discussion you've just seen with the disastrous exchanges that continue to go on between the United States and Russia, between, of course, London and virtually everybody. And the way in which NATO finds itself inexorably going step by step toward thermonuclear confrontation with Russia. Now, we also, by the way, if you have just joined us, earlier referred to certain statements made by President Vladimir Putin this week, which some have tried to characterize as a change in Russian policy. But in fact, President Putin was responding to a kind of, perfidious set of exchanges and discussions that have happened in Europe. And to tell us more about that and about the actual circumstances that we are faced with in this drive to prevent thermonuclear disaster, we have Harley Schlanger, spokesman of the LaRouche Organization. So Harley, welcome. Go right ahead.
Hello, Dennis. How are you?
Not doing too bad.
Well, I want to concentrate on 2 points primarily. And they address this question of how the deceit of Western leadership is making life on this planet very precarious. And secondly, the special role of the British. Now, we saw in the interview with Helga an effort to lift the discussion to the philosophical. And that's what she does in her 10 fundamental principles, which we'll be discussing later in the program. What I want to do is take on two blocks, two psychological blocks that exist in the population that I think is causing people not to recognize the danger, nor to assume responsibility for overcoming the danger. It's clear the leaders of the Western countries are evil, or if they're not evil, they're profoundly stupid for going along with the evil coming from London and Washington. But the question then is, what are the people? You heard these comments about Borrell, and I'll get back to him a little bit later, about Europe as the garden and the rest of the world as a jungle. How can someone like that be the foreign minister of the European Union? How is that tolerated? So I want to talk about these two blocks and realize both of these blocks come from the role of hybrid warfare, psychological warfare, sometimes called brainwashing, that's done through the media, through the political networks, through especially social media, and to create a hostile environment to actually thinking through problems. So I want to address these two questions. The first is the fear of addressing the danger of nuclear war, which comes out in two different ways. One is people saying it'll never happen, or they'll say, as Dennis pointed out, that it's Putin who's responsible for the threat of nuclear war. So let's address that in a moment. And then the second thing I'm going to address is the failure to recognize the role of the British and British geopolitics as central to this crisis. Now, the first point is related to this somewhat stunning admission this week by Angela Merkel that when she signed on to the Minsk Accord, which was an agreement between Ukraine and Russia and Germany and France. Germany and France were the guarantors, that the Ukrainians would stop the killing going on in the Donbass, would negotiate for regional autonomy, and would put an end to what was in a sense a civil war. What people ignore is that from 2014 to 2022, there was a civil war, but it was directed from Kiev, from the Ukrainian government that was installed in the Maidan coup. And who were they killing? They weren't killing Russians. They were killing Ukrainians of Russian descent who spoke Russian and who opposed the coup that took place. But they were Ukrainian citizens being killed by the Ukrainian militia. And this was something that weighed very heavily on Putin's mind in looking at this situation. Now, it had already been stated by Poroshenko, the oligarch who became the president after the Maidan coup, that he only signed the Minsk Accord to buy time to build up Ukraine's military. Well, people thought, okay, maybe that's true of Poroshenko. But then the question is, why were Germany and France not doing more to fulfill the agreement in Minsk? Why not pressure Ukraine to follow through, especially when Zelensky ran for president saying he was going to fulfill the terms of Minsk? Well, this gets to the question of people who say Russia's invasion or special military operation was unprovoked. It was provoked. And this comes out in the conversation Putin had about Merkel's admission when Angela Merkel told a German newspaper that when she signed the accord, it was to buy time for Ukraine to have a military buildup. So she acknowledged what Poroshenko said, but what does that mean? Why did Germany sign it if they intended to violate it? And here's what Putin had to say. He said, it shows that everything we did from the point of view of launching the special military operation was right. It turned out, Putin said, that no one was going to implement the Minsk agreements. The leadership of Ukraine, as follows from what former President Poroshenko has said, acknowledged they were not going to act on what had been signed. But, Putin added, I still expected that the other participants, namely Germany and France, would be sincere with us. It turns out that they also deceived us, their aim being to build up Ukraine's military muscle and prepare it for hostilities. Apparently, Putin said, we found our bearings too late, to be honest. Maybe we should have started all of this earlier. But we had just hoped that we would be able to achieve a settlement within the framework of the Minsk agreements. Now, he went on. He wasn't through with the Merkel betrayal. He said, frankly speaking, I did not expect to hear this from a former federal chancellor, because I've always proceeded from the assumption that the German leadership is sincere with us. Yes, of course, it was on the side of Ukraine and supported it, but it still seemed to me that the Federal Republic of German leadership always sincerely strove for a settlement on the principles that we had agreed on, which were achieved within the framework of the Minsk process. Then he added the kicker. Now there's a question of trust on the agenda, and it is already close to zero. How can there be negotiations, he said? What can be negotiated? Are there any guarantees? And he said, we're ready for agreements, we're open, but this makes us stop to think about who we are dealing with, the Russian leader stated. Now, if you think through that, what is clear is that everyone who said that Russia's action was unprovoked, including NATO officials, including all the media talking heads, the military people and others, they've been exposed as dangerous liars or as fools. In other words, untrustworthy, because they've seen this situation. Many of them knew that this was not a serious attempt with Minsk, that it was not going to be enforced. But that Putin reacted to this and felt the need to launch a special military operation to defend the people of Donbass, the Ukrainian citizens of Russian descent in Donbass who are being shelled and killed, more than 14,000 casualties, to defend them, while the government of Ukraine lied, and now it turns out the government of Germany lied. And it also raises the question of Macron, who suddenly discovered after visiting with Joe Biden on his way back to Europe that Putin had legitimate security questions going into the beginning of 2022. What this means is that when history looks back on this, assuming there is a history, that the Western leadership will be portrayed as liars and fools, and the Western culture as one which lacked the moral fitness to survive. And it may not survive if this tendency towards war continues. Now, the second question I want to take up, and I'm sure we can come back to this in the Q&A, but the question of the British. And I was able to sit in on Zoom on a discussion at Chatham House last Tuesday. Chatham House is the leading think tank of British intelligence. It goes back to the First World War, and they had a topic titled Russia's War on Everybody. Now, I'm going to go through what was said by some of the people who were speaking, but you have to realize, while these people are either academics or journalists, they're integrated, as all of the British academics and journalists are, or many of them, into the United Kingdom intelligence and military structure. And in this case, the two speakers were definitely that. So the topic on hand was, what do you do with the situation in Ukraine right now? And they all had the same talking points. There was a third speaker who wasn't quite as vehement. But the two main speakers were Keir Giles, who's a Chatham House fellow, who's written two books that are important for this. One is called Moscow Rules, and the second one is Russia's War on Everybody. And the other speaker was Edward Lucas, a former senior editor at The Economist, which is the flagship journal of British intelligence, British City of London, I should say. And he's now a columnist for the London Times. What they said is that the problem is Russia's belief that its entitlement to be an empire, and that everything from Russia is disinformation. Lucas described Russia spreading disinformation is typical of the Russian practice of engaging in a whole of society attack. He attacked the West for complacency after the Ukraine coup in 2014. He said Western states should have listened to what was being said in the Baltic states and in Poland about Russia's imperial intentions. He said the German government ignored that. And he said now with this horrendous war, there's no sense of contrition from the West for ignoring the warnings. Now, he attacked the narratives that people have accepted about Russia. And here's one in particular. He said that the belief that the West didn't help Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. He said that's not true at all. The problem was Russian society, not what the West was doing. This is an out and out blatant lie. The West was driven after the fall of the Soviet Union by a desire to steal as much of the Russian raw material resources as possible, the science and technology as possible, and in the process to make sure Russia would be a weak nation and tear it apart through taking out chunks such as Georgia and others. Now, Lucas went on to say that the problem of Russia predates Putin. As Giles agreed, he said the problem is, quote, the way the Russian thinks. And he said we're playing Russian games by Russian rules. And as they were elaborating this, they talked about the psychology of Russia, that Russia's full of self-pity. And he said at the same time, the Russians see themselves as a great empire spanning east to west. And he said the problem with the Germans is that they're subject to Orientalism, that they're willing to look east for solutions. Now, the final thing that Lucas said in this discussion, which is most telling, is he said that our diplomatic and intelligence services failed us by not understanding what I've just said about Russia. These intelligence and diplomatic services, quote, were really good during the Cold War, he said, but we destroyed it, that is the intelligence and diplomatic corps, because we don't think geopolitics is still going on, unquote. Well, he doesn't think that. He thinks that we're still in the middle of a geopolitical confrontation. And that's one of the points that Lyndon LaRouche always made in dealing with these questions, that when the British are involved, the starting point is geopolitics, by which the British mean the necessity of preventing national powers, sovereign nation states, from joining together in common cause. In particular, under the doctrine drafted by Halford Mackinder, this means there must never be an alliance between Western European nations, particularly France and Germany, with Russia that would incorporate Eastern Europe and would extend to Eurasia. That was the existential threat to the British Empire. Now you look at what's been done in the recent period with the support for Ukraine to destroy Russia, with such things as the attack on the Nord Sea or the Nord Stream pipelines. That was done either by the British or the United States. I think there's very little doubt about that. But it wasn't just an attack on Russia, it was an attack on Germany. The whole of NATO's policy is to force Germany to go along with the war against Russia for the purposes of British geopolitics. And the catastrophe in this is that there's a government in Germany which is not only willing but totally committed to doing this. That is, destroying itself, committing suicide. Whether it's because of the so-called green agenda, the transition to clean energy, which combined with sanctions against Russian oil and gas, is putting Germany in a horrific situation for civilian population, for families who can't afford electricity, can't afford food, but also for industry. The deindustrialization of Germany has been a long-term goal of this British imperial policy. And what's the result of this today? Well, the latest opinion poll in Germany shows that Chancellor Scholz's party, the Social Democrats, which is the leading party in the coalition government, is now at 18% support. The Greens are at 18% support. And I think that's a legitimate reflection of the idiocy of a whole section of the German population, which has thrown out science and thrown out industry and technology and embraced green radicalism. But 18%, that shouldn't really mean that much. But if you put that 18% with the Scholz 18%, and then the Free Democrats, the third party, 6%, well, that's only 42%. That means this current coalition government in Germany, which is threatening to put the world into a nuclear confrontation, at the same time destroying the engine of Europe's economy, the German machine tool sector, auto sector, science and technology and engineering. This party, this coalition government, which is committed to that, has less than 50% support, significantly less. So what does that say about the situation? Why are there not more Germans out in the street? Why are there not more Europeans who claim that Europe is an enlightened oasis of liberal thinking, calling for the dismissal of this lunatic Borrell, whose most recent idiocy, besides his comment about the paradise in the Europe that's threatened by the jungle, he had this to say about Africa, the question of why it is that the global South is not supporting the attacks on Russia. Borrell said, well, many Africans don't know where Donbass is or who Putin may be. This is the leader of the foreign policy of the European Union, an absolute, to use a scientific term, a moron. Now, I just want to go a little bit deeper into this whole question of this anti-Russian outlook that comes through these British speakers at the Chatham House event last week by looking at the book by Keir Giles, which everyone refers to, called Moscow Rules: What Drives Russia to Confront the West. And what he said in the book is that he's going to investigate Russia's self-perception. And he said he's doing this because to hope for a different Russia, that is, to make Western policy dependent on a different Russia, is not a viable policy. And what he says is that the mistake is to assume that Russia is a Western country. He said the ideals, values, prejudices, hopes, fears, and motivations that are shared by many Russians are distinctive or alien to the West. This is an out-and-out, almost racist statement of Russophobia. One of the people he quotes on this is Walter Bedell Smith, who was an ambassador to Russia and then later became the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He quotes Smith, who wrote, "Russians are different because wholly different social and political conditions have retarded and perverted their development and set them apart from other civilizations." So it's civilizational is the view that the British have. He quotes Henry Kissinger as an authority, whose book on the Congress of Vienna writes about how when the Russians came after the defeat of Napoleon, that despite their polished manners, they seemed, quote, barely able to conceal a primitive force from before and beyond Western civilization, unquote. Now, he says that the Russians want respect from the West. But he said Russia equates respect with fear, and failure to display deference to Russia fosters the instinct to insist on Russia's own perceived status as a great power and to seek to assert this status in confrontation with the West. Now, this is a view which says which explains why they're saying there's no basis to negotiate with Russia on Ukraine. The only solution is total war with NATO involved. At the beginning of the special military operation, Giles wrote a column in The Guardian titled, "Only Total Military Failure Will Curb Putin's Ambitions in Ukraine." So for the British intelligentsia. And this includes the military establishment. It includes the media, most of the media establishment. I mean, it's ironic. They're talking about Russia thinking they have a special mission. What do these people think of Britain, the great civilizing force of their imperial policy? Well, their argument is you cannot have a negotiated settlement or an agreement with Russia because they're barbarians. The exact point that was made by Yermak, the Ukrainian aide to President Zelensky, when he addressed NATO leaders last week. He said that you can't trust them, they're not civilized. Now, what is essential in Helga's principles is the idea of a return to the conception from the Peace of Westphalia, which made it successful, which is that diplomacy, that relations between nations should be based on recognizing other nations as sovereign, and that part of that sovereignty is that they have legitimate interests for their nation and their people, but that by treating them with respect, with dignity, with, as you might say, the do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule of Christianity, that if you start with that as your assumption, then you can reach agreements for mutual benefit, for cooperation, or at least to avoid war. That does not exist in the British frame of mind. As we know from Tony Blair, who came to the United States in 1999 to the World Affairs Council of Chicago to say that the principle of Westphalia as it regards relations among nations is over. It must end. And he imposed instead the right to protect. In other words, the right to carry out coups, assassinations, and wars against governments deemed less civilized by those with power to do so. And that's why it's so significant to look at what Merkel admitted, that she had no intention of settling the problem in which Ukrainian citizens of Russian descent were being killed by their own government. She had no intention to stop that. And at the same time that the British say explicitly, and this is now coming from the mouth of people like Stoltenberg, like Tony Blinken, that the only basis for negotiation with Russia is once they surrender and go back to Russia. And that's why we face a danger, not because Putin is threatening to use nuclear weapons, but because the West is demonstrating that its intention is to destroy Russia. And as Putin has said on many occasions, he will not allow Russia to be destroyed the way it was during World War II by the Nazis. And that means every resource they have will be thrown into the battle before he'll allow that to occur. And that, by the way, is also US nuclear policy. So let me stop at that, Dennis, and hopefully I've provoked some questions.
Thanks a lot for that, Harley. And there's a lot of questions that does provoke. We've already begun to get a few questions. If you're just joining us, we want to welcome you to today's Manhattan Town Meeting for December 10th. And now we're going to hear from academic Cliff Kirikoff. Cliff has also been a collaborator, worked with our organization on various research projects, including one back in 2004, 2005, 6 around synarchy, or what is called synarchism. It's something that may or may not at some point become appropriate for the discussion. But here today, we've asked Cliff to join us because of his having studied, thought through, and reflected upon Helga Zepp-LaRouche's 10 principles. So Cliff, good to see you, and take as much time as you need. I'm sure in the course of the discussion, we can get to other matters.
Dennis, thank you very much for inviting me to your show. And I look forward to our discussion. And I'm just working on my little iPad here to bring up Helga's talk. And also, hi, Harley, good to see you again. Helga's 10 principles reflect a very traditional Western European approach to international relations that, as she said, developed during the Westphalia era, a Peace of Westphalia, which was 1648, which followed the 30 Years' War, and 1618 to 1648, which was an ideological war. That is to say, it was religious in terms of the Roman Catholic people versus the Protestant people, and very bloody, by the way. The first part of Helga's talk, she mentions to eliminate the concept of oligarchism for good. Well, my reaction to that is we can think about this transatlantic oligarchy, these ruling classes in the United States and their linkages with the ruling class in Europe, which forms a transatlantic oligarchy that is problematic because it continues the traditions of imperialism and war and a spirit of militarism. So Helga suggests 10 principles. The first one was a new international security and development architecture. Point one, perfectly sovereign states. The concept of sovereign states evolved, particularly in the Treaty of Westphalia era, 1648, and was a part of a principle of international law that developed during that era. One famous international lawyer, Hugo Grotius, a Dutchman, embodied, I guess you could say, and wrote extensively on war and peace and diplomacy, and was an advocate of international law and a formulator of international law. A little earlier, we see in Spain a Spanish tradition of international law created by two Spanish intellectuals, Suarez and Victoria. A little later, we see international law being developed in the 18th century by persons such as Vattel, the Swissman, Pufendorf, a German, etc. So I want us to keep in mind this concept of international law, and we can contrast that with the point that Harley makes and also Helga makes of geopolitics, which is to say aggressive national strategies of a zero-sum nature, aggressive national strategies to dominate. So if you're involved in geopolitics, you has the word geography in it, and politics means you want to dominate geographical areas of the planet we all share. Thus, you can say the United States wants to dominate Europe, for example, or dominate Asia, or dominate the Middle East. So I think it's a very good point to begin with the concept of sovereign nation states, Peace of Westphalia. One thing I'll add to that is that part of the principle of sovereignty involves the concept of non-interference in the internal affairs of another sovereign country. Now, this principle of non-interference developed also owing to various religious wars, and it was embodied in the Peace of Augsburg, Germany, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which basically meant a Catholic king should not be interfering in a Protestant king's internal affairs, and a Protestant king shouldn't be trying to make people in a Catholic king's realm into Protestants. So the idea of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, and the idea that each country should develop in its own way, with its own customs, its own culture, its own characteristics. And that's 1555 Peace of Augsburg, which informs the 1648, a little later, 100 years later, Peace of Westphalia. Helga's second point is on the priority of eliminating poverty. And of course, with modern science and technology, etc., poverty can be eliminated through economic development. And we see this, of course, in China as one model, as one example, of the elimination of poverty, of absolute poverty there. And it is said that they brought several hundred million, if not 800 million people out of absolute poverty, and they're raising the standard of living throughout, for example, China. So this concept of alleviating poverty is something that's being done on this planet in a very proactive way. And it's some lessons we could learn from that process. Of course, the point 3 relates to the health, public health. And the COVID crisis certainly has focused attention on public health around the world. It wasn't just limited to North America and Europe and Asia. Africa was impacted, etc. So public health is an international issue when it comes to suppression of disease, etc., as well as scientific research to come up with vaccines or come up with therapies to help people in their medical condition, situation. The fourth point relates to the idea of education. And again, education should be a universal value, and is actually, and we should be encouraging and assisting the development of education in various countries. And now we have the internet, we have computers, we have new technologies that can assist in distance learning, for example, like we have this Zoom meeting here, and we all live in different parts of the United States, and Zoom meetings with Europe. And so modern technology is allowing tremendous advances in education, making them possible. The fifth point, I think, is really a vital one, and it's a key one, and maybe the key one. It's about the international financial system, and it needs to be reorganized. And Helga points out that during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt and his advisors were thinking ahead to the post-war era. And of course, a world war is going to result in a very chaotic global economy in the post-war period. Therefore, why not in 1944 begin planning for international cooperation, and I'll underscore that, international cooperation to assist financial stability, etc. So when the war did end in 1945, we were able to create the various institutions, the so-called architecture, financial architecture. Now, we may or may not agree with the World Bank or the IMF and their relationship to finance capitalism, et cetera, and to maintaining a Western imperialism on the planet. But nonetheless, the idea of international cooperation for financial stability is very important, and there's no reason we couldn't have a new Bretton Woods develop soon. For example, right now, although some people may not want to admit it, right now in the United States, we're in a recession, and we're headed into, according to some economists, and even Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan, who says we're headed into a hurricane, a financial hurricane. And that would mean a sharp recession, if not depression, and that may hit first quarter of next year, which is just coming up, right? Next few months. Meanwhile, we have the war in Ukraine and other problems in the international economic realm, such as supply chain issues, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea of thinking about and pre-planning for 2023 and this hurricane that Jamie Dimon talks about, and you know, it may last a while if there is another crash of 29, or as we saw, what was it, in 1932, and the Credit Anstalt Bank in Austria collapsed, creating even more havoc than the 1929 crash in the United States did. Hence, you had this global depression in the 1930s. I want to emphasize that it wasn't just a depression in the United States. There was a global depression. It impacted Tokyo. It impacted China, Shanghai, all around the world. This financial crisis, this depression had an impact. So point 6 leads to Helga saying that a new economic order must be focused on creating conditions for modern industry and agriculture. Absolutely. And again, we have science and technology that's helping us develop new forms of industrial production and helping us with agricultural production. And a key to this, of course, is infrastructure, as Helga points out, and actually, as Lynn pointed out many years ago. But the key aspect here is infrastructure development. Now, just look at what China, for example, in recent years has done with its own infrastructure. It's amazing. I've ridden on their high-speed trains from Beijing to Shanghai and all around in China, and it's absolutely amazing. The infrastructure development in China, the bridges, all these different things. And now that's being applied to the Belt and Road project, which is fundamentally an infrastructure project. The idea is should be familiar to Americans. Lincoln, during the Civil War, was able to organize the Transcontinental Railroad, for example. Now, our Transcontinental Railroad infrastructure led to the development of new towns, new cities, mining, economic activity, and got us across the continent all the way out to San Francisco and later Los Angeles and up into Seattle later with other railroad infrastructures. So the idea of continental-wide or very large-scale infrastructure development is something that should be or is very familiar to Americans. Just jump on an Amtrak and go from New York to California, for example. So infrastructure is a vital concern for us. The seventh point is about geopolitics, and geopolitics is actually a form of strategy. It's a form of military strategy or a form of national strategy that was, the word actually geopolitik actually originated in Germany way back around the turn of the century, 1900s, early 1900s. Back in that era, you had various advocates of studying geography and relating world geography to world economic development, et cetera, and world politics and military affairs. So this idea of the linking of geography, economic geography, political geography, linking geography to military strategy on a global basis. Mackinder, the famous Professor Mackinder was mentioned earlier, Harold Mackinder, the British sort of theoretician for the British policy in the Eurasia area. So that's the origin of this geopolitics. And we see that it's linked to the problem of militarism as a psychological orientation. And that's pervasive in the NATO world and pervasive in Washington, D.C. among the ruling circles in Washington, D.C., or so-called ruling class, such as it is. But this idea of geopolitics dominating different geographies around the world, economically, militarily, and so on. So it's a very important concept for us to get familiar with. Of course, nuclear weapons should be banned, and that takes us into the whole world of disarmament, which, again, is a part of diplomacy. You have to have a process, a diplomatic process, to promote and effect disarmament. And that's been interrupted by the United States kind of unilaterally. We had different processes of disarmament with Russia, or the Soviet Union, as it used to be called, that were ongoing, involving various types of missiles, the regional type missiles, the so-called INF, intermediate nuclear forces, European-based, or you had your strategic nuclear weapons, etc. And that gets into very complex arguments and complex calculations. How prompt is your missile once you push the button? Will it hit the enemy quickly before the enemy can figure out that you've just launched something and hit you back? Or is your weapon powerful enough should it land on your enemy's territory near one of his missiles complexes? Is it strong enough to destroy that missile complex? And then you get into the idea of well, if it lands right on it, maybe. If it lands a little further away, maybe not. It depends on how strong the enemy has made their fortification, et cetera, circular error potentials, and all these exotic calculations about using a nuclear weapon to destroy an enemy. Also, you have two different types of targeting: counter-force targeting against the enemy's military forces, but there's also counter-value targeting, i.e. just incinerating urban areas, killing millions of people, counter-value. So, anyway, point 8, the existential threat to humanity that we were just talking about requires thinking on the level of a more profound, Helga makes the point, a more profound philosophical thought. Here, what comes to my mind is the idea of a sense of internationalism, a sense of what the Chinese call shared community, but internationalism, the idea of solidarity, human solidarity, solidarity between peoples, dialogue among civilizations, et cetera, et cetera. So here, where her point is quite a good one, and it focuses a bit on philosophy. That's common to us all. You could take a look in Western tradition at, for example, Cicero or something along those lines, and you could take a look at ancient Chinese civilization, or Confucius or Mencius, for example, and you can find points of agreement and commonality, also with various forms of philosophy in India, for example. So finding common ground at the philosophical level is not really a problem for us. It shouldn't be, at any rate. On 10, last one, and I'll finish up quickly. Yes, she makes the point that man is fundamentally good. And this contrasts with the opposing philosophical tradition that man is a beast. Man is just an animal, a beast of burden. I think we remember that song. Was that the Rolling Stones song, Beast of Burden? But at any rate, the idea that mankind, humankind, is special. So she concludes with this idea of a new world economic order emerging, which is a realistic point of view, and the emphasis on the global south. And we could just see this week the meeting of President Xi Jinping going to Saudi Arabia, meeting not only with the Saudi leader, but with leaders of the other nearby Arab states. And that kind of a dialogue among civilizations and a cooperative relationship has led to the signing of many economic agreements and other agreements that we'll probably learn more about in the coming weeks. One of the key points there, though, is, and we want to keep an eye on it, is the fact that Saudi Arabia has been pricing their oil in dollars. If you wanted to buy some oil from them, you'd have to pay them dollars. But now the Chinese have developed with their currency, which is called the yuan, they have an exchange, a petroleum exchange market, you could say, in Shanghai. And now the Saudis could denominate their oil in Chinese money, yuan. And therefore, the dollar is not in the picture anymore. The petrodollar is not in the picture, or less in the picture. And the petrodollar, of course, was the main financial tool of of Wall Street and Wall Street's imperial creations. The issue is Wall Street, and the issue, as Harley pointed out, is the city in London. That's the issue. We can get into that in discussion. But a new economic world order is emerging, and I would make the point, others have observed that the Western finance capitalists and in Western empire wants to bifurcate the world and have a Western financial system and oppose that to an Asian financial system. So the world is dividing now, according to the finance capitalists and the Western imperialists who want to create a bloc system, the West versus the East. We're back to the Cold War. That's exactly what the Cold War was all about, the so-called West versus the East. Now it's being revived. And I would just point out for anyone who's interested that that revival started in 2005, and it was agreed upon by US elites in the policy communities, academic communities, and also in conjunction with the British and even Japanese, etc., circles. So this idea of the democracies versus the autocracies is just a revival of the old Cold War in a new form. So now we have the new Cold War. But I would say, I point your attention to the fact that this started in 2005, even before. This was during the Little Bush era. This consensus started then, and then Obama picked it up. Trump picked it up. Biden picked it up. So we've had almost, 17 years and almost 20 years, 2 decades of elite thought in Washington and in New York, Council on Foreign Relations, of course, and other think tanks in Washington and wherever. This elite thought about so-called democracies versus autocracies. This is a very convenient pretext, a very convenient political rhetoric for the maintenance of the Western Empire, where the Western Empire core being Wall Street and the city of London, the financial centers in Paris and Frankfurt and all that, but the financial centers of the West as the imperial core of the West, which in theory, their theory, not ours, in their theory means Western domination, i.e. so-called democracies, versus the rest, i.e. autocracies. So I think her last point is very important for us all to consider. And yes, we do need a renaissance, as she said, of highest and noble expressions of creativity. And we do need, in her last paragraph, she mentions the creation of an international movement of world citizens. This is simply the concept, again, of internationalism that arose back in the 19th century among the socialists and others, this concept of internationalism, as opposed to the concept of militarism back in that day. So today is not unlike the 19th century. We've got a conflict between a spirit of internationalism, unfortunately opposed by a spirit of militarism. So that's something we need to address. That concludes my remarks, and I look forward to our discussion. And thanks so much, Dennis, for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Cliff. Harley, let me go right to you for a reaction, and let me also let both of you know we've received about 6 or 7 questions. And I've got to check with Dave as to what our overall time is here. But so I want to get to those questions. A couple of them we'll be able to group, a few of them. So Harley, any response?
Well, I think what Cliff did was to make clear the question of principle that shines through from Helga's document, which is titled 10 Principles. And you can take them as he did point by point and show the legitimacy of what's being raised. And then you have to look at it as a whole. What's being presented by Helga? We're in a dying system. The Western unipolar order is dying. And you can't replace it piecemeal. You can't say, well, what if we just got rid of, what if we just went to a gold standard? Or what if we just had disarmament? Or, and you can take any of the particular issues that come up, but the issue here is philosophical. The same philosophical questions that were posed by Ben Franklin when he was organizing support among the American colonials to overturn the British Empire. That it's a philosophical question, and it goes back ultimately to, as you know from the debates during the American Constitutional Convention, where you mentioned Fattle as one, that you had, in a sense, the Leibnizian outlook represented by Franklin and his collaborators versus the Lockean outlook of the British Empire. And fortunately, it was Benjamin Franklin's outlook that succeeded. And what Franklin did to prepare for that was engage in a process of discussion of precisely these kinds of principles, including, after the leading up to the Constitution being ratified, the Federalist Papers of Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. So what Helga's calling for is that these principles be discussed by people all over the world, because we're going through a transition from a collapsing order to something different. Now, will the collapsing order end up obliterating mankind with nuclear war or a global depression collapse? Or can we get to the point where there can be agreements based on these kinds of principles? So I thank Cliff for taking the time to go through that, and I think everyone who heard that should download the principles, read them yourself, and become a fighter for those principles with everybody you know.
Yeah, I'll also say I'd like to know, and you guys can both think about it, whether you can both be available for next week, because I think that the questions that are coming in, and there are more additional, which are good, that this is exactly the process of dialogue that we wanted to try to initiate. I think that's partially happened as a result of the presentations and also the moment that we're in. Let me go right to a few questions. So I'm going to give you two questions together. Harley, they were directed to you. One is from Joshua. He asks, Harley, is there any positive role for Mercedes-Benz or Porsche to boost Germany's industry? And the second question, which is from Johnny, he asked the question, can the German economy survive one more year? Let's take those two together.
Yeah, well, they're directly related, because the illusion is that somehow the transition to electric cars and the green economy will miraculously lead to jobs and technology advances and so on. It's not going to happen. There are limitations to the benefits you can get from switching over to electric vehicles. Among them, the problems with batteries, the raw materials and strategic metals that go into them, and there's a whole lot of issues there. But the broader point, which is probably useful to look at, is it's in the auto sector, particularly in what LaRouche called the machine tool principle, that you actually have the basis for discovering new technologies that will solve these problems. And the problem is not a carbon problem, carbon dioxide. The problem is that we need more efficient means of increasing the energy flux density, and that, of course, includes fusion and things of that sort. Now, historically, Germany has had scientists and engineers who were able to develop new technologies. That's being discouraged now, because we're being told that the world is overpopulated and there's already too much industry. But the specific case of Germany is that the question of whether Germany survives this year is not the real issue. I think there are things that are being done that will ensure there'll be at least a certain amount of electricity and power that can get the German economy through. The broader question is whether there's a commitment on behalf of those people who represent those technologies, the tradition of engineering excellence and the machine tool principle. Will they fight against this insane government with its green deindustrialization policies? And will they also recognize as they are beginning to show, recognize the importance of trade with Russia and China? Will they fight against the European Union and the attacks on Russia and China? So it's an open question whether Germany will survive. At present, it's showing a certain form of senility and subservience, senility in forgetting the great tradition of German science and classical culture, and at the same time, the subservience to London and Wall Street, which is destroying that which made Germany advance as an economy. So what we're fighting for is to pull together the artisans, the farmers, the industrialists, the scientists, the producers, as a movement in Germany to oppose the domination of this British system and British ideology represented in the Green New Deal and the Great Reset. So, at this point, what we see is, in my interview with Helga a couple of days ago, she said she's getting optimistic. She's seeing some openings. And the Solovyov interview is certainly an example of that. We have many other examples, Diane Sayre's campaign. But it's an open question. And that's why I would say the most important thing is help us answer it by becoming part of our movement.
Okay, questions are continuing to multiply. That's fine, and I just wanted to. I'm going to give this one to you, Cliff, and I just want to mention to people who are watching that Dr. Kirikov is also the president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development. And the reason I reference that about the Institute for Peace and Development is this next question. This is from Steve. This is actually posed to you, Harley, but I'm going to give it to Cliff. With my own country being run by traitors, not representative of its citizens, of the United States, how can the United States think of anything international? And putting China together with Russia, both as friends on the same level, is not needed now, in my opinion. And Cliff, I just would ask that you might reference your work in the United States Senate, just so he has a view of your view of this process.
All right. Yes, I, in past incarnations, served in the federal government and in the think tank world as well, national security realm. So I'm an academic, but I'm also someone that comes from the national security realm as well. And when I was in the Senate for 11 years on the Senate staff, professional staff, and I served a number of years as senior professional staff member on what's called the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. So various committees in the Senate, Foreign Relations, Armed Services, etc. I was on Foreign Relations. So I got to see many things from the inside, of course, and developed some concerns in my 11 years in the Senate. I developed some concerns about the quality and competence, let's say, of our national leadership in Washington, and also the quality and competence of the academic world and think tank world that supplies the politicians with their talking points, and also concerns about the Pentagon and what became the leading role of the Pentagon in our foreign relations, because we've been at war for several decades now, and the role of the State Department and our diplomacy is kind of plays second fiddle to all the wars that the Pentagon creates. So the diplomats have to serve the generals rather than the other way around. There's a problem, and I think Harley made some interesting comments about traditional American thought. The traditions of Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, the founding fathers, our original ethos when it came to foreign policy and our own diplomatic relations with the rest of the world. We were friends with Russia. We're friends with China. We sent out the ship, the Empress of China, on Washington's birthday, way back in 1784, something along those lines. We were in the 1780s trading with India. So for us as Americans, it was interesting and fascinating and certainly commercially rewarding to trade with other countries. As a matter of fact, we were trading with Russia, particularly up in the northern part of Russia. You have the St. Petersburg area and then the access to the sea and all Baltic. And we were trading even before our War of 1812. We had extensive trade relations with Russia and good relations with Russia. And that continued through the Civil War. And actually, the Russian ambassador to the United States after the Civil War, through the 1880s, 1890s, he was the what we call the dean of the diplomatic corps. He was the most senior diplomat, and the Russian ambassador was very well liked in Washington back in that era, 1880s, 1890s, etc. So and then moving into the Soviet period. Of course, we had our differences, ideological differences, but when it came to World War II and fighting Nazism, we worked with Stalin and the Soviet Union to defeat Nazism, etc., and Japanese militarism. So the fact is that for 200 years, let's say, or more, 225, we've had diplomatic relations with Russia and China since the 1780s and 90s. And I would point out some of these relations were prior to our becoming a republic. They were in the early period of our, after just 1783, 4, 5, 6, like that. So the basic idea of U.S.-Russian or U.S.-China relations should be based on the historical context that we have had diplomatic relations for 2 centuries. With respect to China, those relations were interrupted between about 1950 and the Korean War and about 1972-3, when we had the President Nixon opening to China, followed up by President Jimmy Carter's continuing that opening and formalizing our new relationship with New China, Chinese. So we had 200 years of relations with China, and only that 20-year period there where the Cold War and the Korean War interfered with relations. But those were picked up in 72 and Carter in 79, and we've had relations since then. What is particularly shocking to me is the fact that both Republicans and Democrats, and particularly Republicans, this is shocking, have rejected President Nixon's opening to or détente, you could say, with Russia and opening to China. So here we are 50 years after President Nixon, with Henry Kissinger of all people, opening up relations and trying to make them better with China and with Russia. And we have Mike Pompeo denouncing President Nixon's memory of those engagements, positive, constructive diplomacy. And where did Pompeo make a big speech a couple of years back? He made it right at the Nixon Center, Research Center, Presidential Center. So here Pompeo steps into the Nixon Presidential Center and denounces President Nixon's diplomacy with China and Russia. Now, coming back to the point of diplomacy that I've been trying to make and others have made today, diplomacy, the earliest record of diplomacy between human beings that we have is a treaty between the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Hittites. Now, this is like 4,000 or 5,000 years old. So human beings on this planet in organized societies have been engaged in diplomacy, at least at least in the recorded record of it, at least since this particular treaty between ancient Egypt and the ancient Hittites. And actually a copy of that, whatever cuneiform or however you call that writing in the old days, a copy of that treaty is actually at the United Nations headquarters, is kind of symbolic of the origins of diplomacy for the last 4,000 or 5,000 years. So the problem, to respond to the question, the problem right now in U.S.-China and U.S.-Russia relations is not the Chinese or the Russians. The problem is the militarism and the mindset of the ruling circles in Washington, D.C., which people call the swamp, the foreign policy networks called the blob, etc. You have your neoconservatives, which are Cold War Zionists out of the Truman era. You've got your military-industrial complex, your Cold War hawks that are just not necessarily ideological, but they're just Cold War hawks. They're militarists. They like war. And you have your industrial base, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and all these characters that support that. So the issue for us is to rethink our relationship with the world. The U.S. is going to end up alone in this changing world if we don't change our own ways. The U.S. will be alone, and the rest of the world will move on. And frankly, it is moving on. We are already in the transition. The unipolar world is over. It has been over. It's over. The elite in Washington hasn't adopted or adapted to that yet, but the U.S. unipolar world is over. It's finished. And now you have a new emerging international multipolar system with China and Russia and India and Indonesia, where we just had that G20 meeting. And so, and as Helga mentioned, all these new platforms and processes, Belt and Road, SCO, Eurasian Economic Union, BRICS, BRICS, which is expanding. So the old Washington-dominated unipolar world is finished. And the issue for the swamp people in Washington, as well as for American citizens across the entire country, is to think to themselves, all right, the world has changed and is changing rapidly. How do we want to change our ways? And by doing so, engage constructively with the world and help build this new world with a shared future that people can look forward to. I mean, right now, the future is looking a little dismal with the war in Ukraine, etc. So we want to think forward. How do we build a world worth looking forward to, which was the challenge that Franklin Roosevelt faced and the American leaders faced in the World War II era. Defeat the Nazis and the German militarists, and well, what kind of a world do we want to build? Well, we want to build a cooperative world, a peaceful world. We want to support the United Nations, of course. So at any rate, that's my answer.
Very good. Charlie, I'm sure you may have other things to say to add to that question, but I want to put another one in to you now. This is from Missy, and the question is, question and observation. I'm still mad at that man for laughing at Helga, Vladimir Soloviev, when she explained to him that most Americans are good, but propagandists hide the true America. How can we show people like him what the real America is? And I think that would be useful. There's another question I'll put in here also, just for atmospherics purposes. This is from Crystalliz, who says, from my point of view, Europeans are jealous of Russia's vast amounts of land. What are your thoughts? And that might be something we take up separately, but I just wanted to indicate it so we can keep things moving. So, Harley.
Well, on the question of the nature of the American people, I raised that in my opening remarks, where I said that if you look at the quality of statecraft that has represented the United States, especially since 9/11, we've chosen terrible leaders. We've tolerated polarization. We've tolerated all kinds of things. Some people would say, well, we had Trump to change that, and it didn't change it. And people are sitting there saying, well, the white helmets are going to come, or the men on the white horses are going to come in and save us. Look, if America wants to be respected in the world, we have to do what Cliff was just talking about. Go back to our traditions that made us respected, that built our nation, and that were based not on an exclusionary uniqueness, but the idea that the uniqueness of our beginnings, that is, we were an anti-colonial revolution, is relevant today. Reach out to Africa. When you think about what's happening in Africa now, you have nations that are being starved to death. While Burrell talks about the great paradise in Europe, Putin asks, why are you not helping to feed those people from your great paradise? So, from the United States, we look at what we're sending to Africa. We're sending counterinsurgency units. We're sending military. We're not doing what China's doing, which is helping to rebuild or to build up the infrastructure in Africa. So if we're worried about our image, we have to change it. Our image reflects the horrible policies that the United States has backed for most of the last 20 to 30 years. Now, I agree with what Helga said. That doesn't reflect the American people, except that the American people are not fighting it. The American people have shown a capacity to roll up their sleeves and do things to help. But we had things like, for example, Haiti. And what did we have? We had a bunch of corruption. The Clinton, Bush, I think Bush was part of an initiative, which raised a huge amount of money, almost none of which got to help the people of Haiti, who were in a horrible crisis. So, to the extent that we want to change our image, let's change what we're doing. And that means a change at the top, but you get that change at the top by having the kinds of philosophical discussions that reflect the image of man, the inherently good nature of man and good nature of Americans, as opposed to having the kind of culture that we've settled into with the Instagram and so on, the social media culture, the bullying culture, the polarized culture, the nasty politics, instead of talking to people with this idea that you're having a human-to-human conversation. And I'll tell you something interesting. What you see when Putin talks, for example, when he raises this question of Merkel, he didn't say that what he could have said. He could have said Merkel is a liar. People have died because of Merkel's lies. He said, we still wish to have a settlement in this situation. That's what we need from our leaders, and not more weapons and not more finger pointing and so on. But we need solutions. And I think it's going to have to come from the American people, because our political leadership is corrupt and immoral virtually across the board.
I just want to say something just on that myself, is that if you think about the character of the personage of Martin Luther King, or you think about the character of the personage of JFK, just think about how they addressed people. Then think about anyone in America, anyone in public office anyway, who addresses people. Think about how they sound. Think about the way in which they speak. Think about the things with which they're preoccupied. What we could do is right now, in the form of the kind of dialogue we're having here, we could perpetuate this, we could amplify this, we could expand it to many people all over the country. Imagine if you had, whether this is in the form we've talked about it last week around the performance of the Dona Nobis Pacem, this particular project we have to grant us peace, which is a three-part canon, which was written either in the 17th or 18th century, probably 18th century. And have this performed because it's simple enough that people can learn it, but it's also important because it's polyphonic music. The idea of that, and the idea of people, normal people all over the world, all singing Dona Nobis Pacem, creates a different interaction and therefore dialogue. And that's how you change the image right away. And it's something that I would just encourage people to think about, since that's the purpose both of our show today and of our actions overall in this month. In fact, if we just want to mention that people should consider joining or becoming members of the LaRouche organization. There's ways that you can do that. We're going to post the link in the chat and comments. There are a few other questions, as I said. So I want to return for a minute to that one question about Europeans are jealous of Russia's vast amounts of land. What are your thoughts? And then there was a second part to that question, which I'm trying to bring up. Just give me a minute here. And
why don't I start with that one, Dennis?
Sure. Why don't you? Well, let me put this in. What about the Great Reset purpose? What is this, a utopia? It's sort of a socialist utopia, which is being introduced by greedy capitalists. Now, can this even work? Guys, that's the second part of that. Go ahead.
All right. Well, on the first one, I wouldn't say the Europeans are jealous of Russia. I'd say they're acting stupid. They've lost the sense of how a nation functions. You know, if you think about the post-war period, you think about Charles de Gaulle, you think about the efforts by people like Mattei in Italy. There was a sense that you had to have a purpose for rebuilding, and the purpose was to avoid the weak governments that blundered into 2 world wars in the 20th century based on British geopolitics. Today, there's I would say, rather than jealousy of Russia, there are, on behalf of many people in Europe, a recognition that a relationship between Germany and Russia, for example, would be good for both countries. That's what the British want to stop. That's what they want to prevent. I think in Italy and France, you have similar sentiments. And I know in Austria, people have no problem with Putin. In fact, Putin was invited to dance at the wedding of the former foreign minister. The problem comes not from the European people out of jealousy for Russia. It comes from the British, who want those raw materials for themselves. And if they can't get them, they're prepared to destroy Europe. And we see that in terms of the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. We just see it across the board. What's the purpose of arming Ukraine? To kill every male in Ukraine? To send them to their death? Well, yes, it is, because that's the British role, is to destroy Russia through destroying Ukraine. The same way they deployed in World War I to get the French and the Russians against the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, you know, it's a failure to learn from history, but it's also a certain intellectual laziness and a certain complacency. The idea that you know, what Burrell said about Europe being a paradise, many people still think that, even as they're shivering and hungry this winter. So I think this whole situation could be an incredible wake-up call, but it's something that we're going to have to do. Now, as far as people have correctly identified the Great Reset as a terrible policy, but there are all kinds of theories that it's communists and socialists doing it. It's an attempt to save a collapsing system by creating another system run by the same people who collapsed this system, using such phony arguments as global warming, the carbon dioxide problem, and the idea that that many people have is that government is the problem, and so if you have governments posing a solution, you can't support it. What if governments are run by people who are committed to the well-being of their population? That's the problem. We don't have that. So instead of focusing abstractly on the idea of that's being fed to us of socialism, capitalism, what's happened is we have a systemic breakdown. This is something Lyndon LaRouche forecast 51 years ago. He was absolutely right in what he said. He's written hundreds of books and articles and given speeches repeatedly about the failure of the drive from the neoliberals of London and Wall Street to control the world's resources, to reduce the world's population. And that's what they're doing. That's what the Great Reset is. They don't care about socialism, communism, capitalism. They concern themselves with their survival and eliminating what they consider useless eaters, and therefore having fewer people to have to share the bounty of nature. That's the problem. Those are the oligarchs. That's what we have to defeat. And it means we have to have a clear conception of what has been the greatest threat to the oligarchy in history, which is the successful deployment of the American economic system, especially in the form that Lyndon LaRouche developed in his economic writings. So I think rather than trying to look at secondary issues, that's the primary issue. We've got to get back to these ideas that LaRouche saved about the American system and developed, because that's the way we solve these problems.
All right, Cliff, just wanted to see if you had any response on the matter of the Great Reset. Otherwise, one other, this is sort of a more amorphous question, so I'm going to sort of pose it. And it was that you had mentioned some things about the 19th century and talked a bit about this idea of internationalism versus militarism. And is that what we are seeing reflected in the NATO policies of today? That's probably the best way to put it. The person was actually sort of commenting about the news of the week also, and this that NATO has said something about the potential for the war to escalate a day prior to the missile attack miles from Moscow. Nuland was in Kiev. So is the sort of idea is this kind of as an ensemble sort of just sort of the resurrection of this earlier 19th century outlook, or just the extension of this into the future, sort of because they have no other ideas of what to do? I think I'm muted. I think you're muted.
How's that? Am I
Yep, that's
back?
better.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So that's the point I was trying to make earlier was that there's a persistence or a continuity of this psychology or mentality of militarism. And we mentioned Nietzsche, and the late 19th century Europe was suffused, permeated with this Nietzschean thought that then went with Darwin and Spencer, and this whole idea of survival of the fittest, and that to them meant, oh, well, you have to start some wars to prove you're the fittest. And so and all these backward civilizations, well, you know, we're the fittest, we're the Europeans, we're the white people, etc. So there's a persistence of this the psychology of militarism in Western elites, not just in the United States, but in Europe too. And the contrast back in the 19th century, among the socialists and others, of course, was internationalism, a spirit of international solidarity, diplomacy. Let's have the international postal union. How do you mail a letter from one country to another? Well, you have to get the countries together and agree on a postal union. Well, what about telegraphs? Well, you have to get countries together to organize how to cooperate on telegraphs. Later on, after aviation, well, how do you fly from one country to another country? Well, you have to have an international organization that kind of manages air travel, you know? So this idea of international solidarity and cooperation among nations. And then, of course, you had the League of Nations and the United Nations grow out of that spirit of the 19th century, the spirit of internationalism. League of Nations, United Nations. But today, we have this reversion, or you could say persistence of this militarism in various circles in the ruling class, or ruling classes in Europe and in the United States, and in the so-called swamp in Washington, or the blob in all of these different think tanks, everyone thinking they're so clever because they have the latest take on geopolitics and how to do the Russians in or how to do the Chinese in. It's actually it's kind of Orwellian, and that takes me to a different point. We're living in the WEF. It's an oligarchy, but it's a tyranny. They're erecting a tyranny. I think we need to ponder this. Central bank digital currency can be used for a tyranny. Artificial intelligence, etc., can be used to create tyranny. This is Orwellian. And that's what the WEF is all about. It's creating a tyranny. The oligarchs are creating a tyranny, global tyranny. And that's something that needs to be resisted. Something earlier that Harley mentioned about the American people. Well, I don't doubt that the American people want to do the right thing. On the other hand, the oligarchy and the politicians have totally different ideas about policy. The biggest problem the American people have right now is being lied to by the media. How can you take a public opinion poll about China, for example, or Russia these days, when the public has been bombarded by the media and the other we want to call them Silicon Valley social media type things too. All of that, the media, the social media, all this. The public is bombarded by negative information and disinformation about Russia and China. And I want to make this point very clear, that NATO is engaged in a very, very sophisticated research and study, including the United States and all NATO members, France, and what they call cognitive warfare. Just Google cognitive warfare, NATO, and start reading the unclassified reports that you'll find on your screen. So this idea of cognitive warfare, we used to call psychological warfare. In the old days, they used to call it propaganda. But now the modern concept is cognitive warfare. It's a battle for people's minds, cognitive warfare. And that's where we're getting all this disinformation about the Ukraine, disinformation about China, Russia, you name it. And the American people, it's very difficult for the American people to gain an understanding of the facts of international life today because of the filter and the lies that the media and social media, legacy media, social media are propagandizing the American people with. This is very important, and it's actually legal because in 2012-13, Congress passed a law that allows the federal government to lie to the American people. They overturned what was called the Smith-Mundt Act, which prevented that. So we're in a world of Western lies and Western disinformation that is very difficult for the population of the United States or other countries in Europe, etc., to get the truth and the facts about various situations in the world. So I think one of the, following Harley's point, one of the major problems we have is overcoming this media bubble and media lies, this Orwellian state that we've fallen into. And that's, I think, a very major challenge for the American people, is to work their way out of the lies propagated by the media on behalf of the military-industrial complex and all that, and also the education system. K through 12 and higher education is permeated with so-called critical theory and very bizarre thinking. So there's a serious cultural problem in the United States. I would say since the Kennedy assassination, we've been kind of going downhill culturally. Vietnam War, et cetera, one war after another. So I think the United States, as Americans, we need to be thinking about strengthening our culture. And as Harley said, returning to first principles, returning to the principles of the early republic, the founding fathers and all that. George Washington's farewell address is a basic document, or as was mentioned earlier, the Federalist Papers, basic documents. And that represents the ethos, the thinking, the culture that got America, the United States, going in the first place. And we've strayed very, very far from that to where today Washington has fully supported the Nazi regime in Ukraine and lying about it. And the United States is occupying part of Syria and lying about it, etc. And the United States created ISIS and created some of these terrorist groups, thinking it was very clever to create certain terrorist groups to get some leverage in the Middle East or whatever. Well, now you got blowback. So the American public has great challenges right now in terms of obtaining the facts, obtaining realistic assessments of the international situation. For example, Ukraine isn't winning. The Russians are defeating Ukraine, the NATO war machine in Ukraine. And as Harley pointed out, these fellows in England at the Chatham House, so-called organization, which the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations derived from in 1920s, they're perpetuating falsehoods. And the British are good at that. There was a famous book by Arthur Ponsonby called Falsehood in Time of War, 1928-29. Worthwhile reading. It's online. You can just look it up. And that was basic British propaganda technique circa that era. So we have a lot of work to do. That's it.
Thank you, Cliff. And we're going to sort of begin to go to a close here. Let me ask you, well, actually, let me do this, Harley, because there are a couple of questions that have come in, which we can do as the end and sort of draw down to concluding statements as well. So one question which is from Michelle. Is the fact that no mention of Saudi Arabia being British is astounding. Why no mention of this? Thank you. That's one question. And I will reference something. And let me do it right now. This is a document. I don't know if I can get it up on a screen. Can that be seen? Yes. Saudi Arabia in the year 2023, written by Lyndon LaRouche. You see the date there, June 1983. There's a document that he also wrote, also in 1983, a 50-year development policy. Can I get that up there? Oh, there it is. There, that's nice and big. A 50-year development policy for the Pacific Oceans Basin. That means between 1983 and 2023. 2033, excuse me, 2033. So that's for 10 years from now. Here's another document from 1983 written by Lyndon LaRouche called The Design for a Leibnizian Academy of Morocco. Here's another document written by Lyndon LaRouche in 1983 called Beam Weapons, the Strategic Implications for Western Europe. Now, I just want to note that this was not even the primary work that Lyndon LaRouche was doing in 1983. That was the year that Lyndon LaRouche was successful in causing Ronald Reagan to adopt the policy known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And our organization spent really the bulk of its time focused on that, as did Lyndon LaRouche, who was involved also in back-channel negotiations with people in the Soviet Union at that time. And the reason I thought this is a useful point to make this observation is that we're talking about this issue of civilization and culture. These people are using these terms that we referred to about the uncivilized Russians and what their civilization supposedly is. Yet in their midst was somebody that was campaigning for the office of the presidency of the United States that was doing this kind of work. Now, here's the issue that I would ask people who just saw what I put up there. The document I couldn't find, I may be able to find it before the end of the program, is The Science of the Human Mind, which he also wrote in 1983. So the idea here is what kind of intellect is required in the United States to respond to the actual challenges that the United States is posed with. Lyndon LaRouche, as a presidential candidate, but also as an American, took it upon himself to write these documents and to think about these questions because he believed that he was, as an American, responsible to do that. So I think I hopefully said something, and you can, of course, add anything you want to that question, Harley. The second question was asked by Chuck, who asked the question, does Germany have a figure like Elon Musk who can help Germans to look up to the stars of science as opposed to the termites that the greenies want them to become? And I was just caused me to recall, Harley, some of the discussions that we've tried to do about Walter Rathenau and others who are clearly more than Lilliputian. So I just wanted to reference that. So I wanted to throw both those questions your way and just get any responses you have.
Well, you actually, by showing those documents, did two things. One is you made me very jealous of what you have there. I've been looking for some of those, and because I've moved a few times in recent years, I can't find all those old documents. But we do have the LaRouche Legacy Fund, and we're going to put them all together for people. So that's a good thing. And basically what you're saying, Dennis, is the answer to the question the person asked earlier about the image of America. Is the image of America Joe Biden or Donald Trump or Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or the Bushes? Or do people see Lyndon LaRouche as an American? And as you just pointed out, Lynn traveled the world. He took into his mind and heart the conditions on the planet facing every nation and offered solutions. That's the American way. And Lynn often said that he did this as someone from the World War II generation. When people talk about the Great Generation, well, that generation was beaten down. But nevertheless, Lynn, as a representative of that, Kennedy as a representative of that, had this commitment to use the experience of the best aspects of the American history to provide answers for how we can get the world out of the problems of poverty, out of underdevelopment, so that every child had the opportunity growing up to look at the sky and think, maybe I'll be the next person who walks on the moon or colonizes Mars. So I think that's really the most profound way to address this question of what do we do to change the image of America. People around the world don't hate Americans, they hate our government. Well, most people in the United States don't like our government, but it's not the government per se, it's the people who run it. And that's why I always emphasize we have to take power out of the hands of these corporate cartels. And as Cliff was saying, one of those cartels is the media. But the media is also totally integrated into the various cartels, including the advertising industry. So, our job is to, in a sense, democratize America so that it can become a republic again. Take the power back for the people and away from these institutions that are corrupted and are part of this global establishment. Now, in terms of Germany, Germany has a lot of figures historically. Rathenau is one. The people from the space program, Kraft Erika, who a close personal friend of the LaRouches, is another. You had the Hans Obert. There were scientists and engineers, the Daimler, as an example, and there are people like that today. People who have essentially been made little. So they're not thinking about what they can contribute to humanity. That's why I think it's so interesting that we're starting to see some of the industrialists mobilizing to change the policy toward Russia and China in Germany. But it's still at a very low or small level. And that's why, again, I come back to this point. I've made it a few times. People who are looking for solutions, start by looking at yourself. What are you doing to educate the people you know, to educate people you don't know, to get these ideas out? And I have so many people who say to me, well, every time I talk to my family members, I get crap back from them. People were afraid to go for Thanksgiving dinner this year because of what they'd get from their friends and family. Well, don't be afraid of that. If you love them, if there's something lovable about family members, try to connect with the higher spirit of both the true American in them, but also the longing for the eternal, for an immortal reason to continue to fight for the good. And it's there. It's you have to be clever. You have to be insightful. You have to use all your powers. You have to be patient. But you also have to be funny and use irony. And, I think this is one of the things that, there was a joke a while ago that among the things Dick Cheney killed was humor and irony in the United States. This is something we have to bring back as a political tool. And one of the great people who practiced this was Lyndon LaRouche. So I would urge people to become familiar with Lynn. Look at some of these documents Dennis showed. Again, we have the LaRouche Legacy Library coming out. We have many things on our website. That's how we're going to revive the spirit that we've been talking about tonight.
Very good. And Cliff, just to give you an opportunity, if there's anything that you'd want to say in closing that you haven't had a chance to say yet, or anything you'd like to add?
I would just add to think we should be thinking about what it means to be a citizen in this republic, and how to revive civics. The only advice I would give right now, the simplest thing, is just read Washington's farewell address. You can Google and you can find his farewell address and think about that, what he was saying. And he was assisted by Hamilton and Madison and others. And read his farewell address and then compare that to the present swamp in Washington. And then hopefully that might inspire you to get active, become an activist for peace and for restoring our republic. I've tried to put a few materials on my little institute's website, the Washington Institute for Peace and Development, and I have a resources page there with a bibliography of things. And I also have a little podcast, World Politics Today. I'm just starting up, trying to help educate folks. So you might want to take a look at that, Cliff Kirchhoff, World Politics Today podcast, which I'm just starting. But I've enjoyed, thank you very much, Dennis and Harley, for inviting me today. And I really enjoyed our conversation. And I want to thank our viewers, our listeners, for tuning in.
Well, thank you very much, Cliff, and of course, Harley. And thank everybody for participating, particularly all the people who asked questions. I'd like to also say this is sort of exemplary of what we would like to see going on, including next week. If you have other questions, or others of you who didn't have a chance to ask a question, please feel free to direct those questions either to Cliff, Harley, myself, and know that our idea is to have that kind of discussion around these 10 principles of Helga Zepp-LaRouche become the province of the chat rooms on social media. We can say, well, that's a hard thing to do, but is it? The real question is to start it and see what happens. Have some fun. That's always what Lynn used to tell us, is to have fun. And it's a way of, you can have fun by surprising people with how much better they are than they think they are. Sort of like Vladimir Soloviev was wondering, right? He sort of said something that Joe Biden once said to one of our organizers, Bill Ferguson, up in New Hampshire. It was back in 1988. And after a certain discussion that had happened with Biden, which baffled him because we were talking to him about a rather important idea, actually about music. He said, the problem with Lyndon LaRouche is that he thinks people are smarter than they really are. And at that moment, he was referring to himself, that moment of candor. So we don't believe that people are as dumb as Biden thought he or believes he is, or and others believe that they are. We believe that people are far better than that. In this document, which I did find, by the way, The Science of the Human Mind, which was written in October of 1983, it has a date of February 1984. Lyndon LaRouche has a little passage I'd like to just use for conclusion. He said, beyond the 1,000 odd who compose the inner core of our International Philosophical Association, modeled on Leibniz's and Plato's notion of an academy, there are tens of thousands presently immediately associated with the same political efforts as the author within the United States, and millions in the United States and abroad touched significantly by the influence of his work at all levels of public and private work and responsibilities. It is abhorrent to the author that there should be anything secret about the method that he employs, meaning how Lynn was writing, how he was formulating policy, and how he was acting. There are growing numbers who have the right and the wish to know. And so the reason that he wrote this was to talk about that. But also, you've seen demonstrated, just in not just the documents I indicated, but also the power of his ideas. Today, we did not do an excerpt from Lyndon LaRouche for technical reasons. But we invite you all to get to know him and to get to know him by discussing the 10 principles that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has proposed for a durable peace and development architecture. I assure you, if Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or other world leaders had the idea that any such discussion were actually becoming current in the United States, it would give them hope that something else, something new in the realm of policy could emerge. And so we ask you to work with us on that, to join the LaRouche organization in our work, become a member. We'll put the information in the links below, and engage with us in getting the 10 principles to become the topic of discussion, the primary topic of discussion in the United States. And so on behalf of the LaRouche organization, I want to thank you all for listening to today's Manhattan Town Meeting. We'll see you again next week.